To all those people watching, I would like to remind everyone that this video is not made strictly for kids. It is for older fans and adults too. Enjoy the fucking video! This video is brought to you by my loyal patrons. Register now at any tier to watch new videos 1 month in advance before they're made public. Link is in the description. After refusing to move from the tunnel due to his vanity, Topham Hatt and the passengers were fed up with Henry, and so, as punishment, Topham ordered his men to break him up. Poor Henry wished he hadn't been so silly. Because of that, another engine had to look after his work for the time being, until Henry learned his lesson. Topham had one engine in mind as he came to the sheds at Vickerstown. 98462, I would like you to look after Henry's trains for a while. Absolutely not, replied 98462 crossly. Neither will I, added 87546. We are important engines like Gordon. We don't pull slower trains like these substandard engines. I'll do it, sir, replied James, smiling. I appreciate that, James, but I need an engine to look after the trucks, so I'm afraid I can't spare you at the moment. Topham sighed. He was in need of an engine. He could go back to the tunnel and ask Henry to do it, but he feels that the big green engine would still refuse to leave the tunnel because it might rain again. Gordon would never do it since he would be a piece of work to deal with since he thinks it would bruise his own ego. Thomas needs to look after the yards, and the other three are needed for their own work as well. He then looked towards Edward. I guess Edward will do it. After all, the coaches and passengers liked him better than those two. He then walked towards him and said, Edward, could you look after Henry's trains, please? And then explained about Henry in the tunnel. We need to show everyone that we are a working railway, and that we put our passengers first. It's important, Edward, to keep up with the railway's image. Indeed, sir, agreed Edward. That's a good engine. Now off you go. Before Edward puffed away, he could hear the snicker of the two engines nearby, but he ignored them, and he puffed away to collect his train.
If you ever visit the island of Sodor and are interested in the stories from the various railways, then you should visit the Railway Archives. It's a treasure trove of stories over the years with all of the engines across the island of Sodor, big or small. Let's take a look at all the stories that are a blast from the past for the engines of Sodor.
Edward had pulled a train before. It was around the time when the guard had made him late, as he was having his elevensies at his home. Ever since that day, Edward had been let out, but it was mostly for shunting or goods work. He didn't mind the job he was doing, as he was so glad to be out and about like a really useful engine. He was so pleased that he got to pull a passenger train once more. It's amazing the fat director had chosen a clapped-out engine to help with the railway's image. What a joke! chortled 98462. Only because you refused to do Henry's work, replied Edward crossly. He only chose you because you were the only engine left to do such a low-rate job. Low-rate job indeed, fumed Edward. You might not like slow trains, but they're just as important as pulling the express. Perhaps one day you might see that for yourself. And after the guard blew his whistle, Edward puffed away. You're just an old pile of scrap, Edward, called out 98462. Just try and watch me, Edward called back. But all day, Edward was getting very tired from puffing up and down the line. He was glad to stop and have a rest, but it wouldn't last long, and Edward would just leave the station and puff on to the next. When he pulled into Vickerstown with his last train for the day, he felt exhausted. Oh, I can see why Henry was good with this, he thought as he puffed away to the yards. Perhaps the fat director might reconsider when I see him. He saw him at the sheds. Edward, I had heard from all our passengers that you've done an excellent job today. I hope you do well tomorrow when you keep this up. Edward wanted to tell him, but he didn't want to let the fat director down. Yes, sir. That's a good engine. Have a good rest. And he walked away. But the three big engines could see that Edward was tired. As if you can keep up. You should just give up, huffed Gordon. Why should Edward give up? Replied Molly crossly. He's been a good help for us with Henry bricked up and all. You three should show some respect like what a real engine is supposed to do. A lead greedy agreed as well. Gordon, 98462 and 87546 just sniffed and went to sleep. Thank you both, replied Edward happily as he yawned and went to sleep. The next morning, Edward was still sleeping. But when he woke up, it was nearly time for his first train. Oh dear, he gasped, and he puffed quickly away. He puffed into the station where the coaches were waiting. Well, 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 so much for the engine to keep up with the railway's image, teased 98462. The passengers grumbled and complained about being late. Edward felt sad and wanted to try and do his best to make up time. He puffed along the line as quickly as he could, but then... Oh no! He cried, my safety valve! And he went slower and slower in a cloud of steam and had to stop. The passengers complained, but when Edward's crew told them what had happened, they felt sorry for the old engine instead. Oh, I should have told Topham Hatt last night, he sighed to himself. Molly came and pushed Edward to the next station. Some of the passengers were then transferred by bus and the Scarlowy. Then Molly took Edward back to Vickerstown. Topham Hatt was there waiting for him. I'm sorry for letting you down, sir, replied Edward sadly. No, Edward, I'm sorry. I had a feeling you were getting tired, but I was thinking about myself instead of the well-being of my engines. Edward was surprised to see this. Usually Topham Hatt was strict with the engines, but he was glad to see this side. I think maybe it's time to let Henry out of the tunnel. I'll go and see him when I have the time tomorrow. For you, Edward, I think shutting in the yard with Thomas will be good for you. After all, you deserve it after running around the railway, and I'm proud of you all the same. Edward was happy. But who will pull the train, sir? Don't worry, I know who. The next day, Edward was prepared and was shunting in the yard with Thomas. Thomas was glad to see that his friend was okay. Be careful with that safety valve, Edward, teased Gordon. Perhaps you should heed that warning of yours, Gordon. It could happen to any engine, replied Edward. Ha! A modern engine like me would never burst his safety valve. Now excuse me, I have an express train to run. Thomas, bring me my coaches. And you, 98462, you have the local to pull. Later that day, Gordon rushed down the main line with the express. The fat director was on board as well. Hurry, 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 he panted. Chickety-chock, 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 said the coaches. He could see Henry up ahead. In a minute, I'm going to poop-poop at Henry. He was almost there when... say that the rest was history.